y'all ready to talk about emojis? Yeah. All right. So my name is Julie Lewis. I'm President and CEO of Digital Mountain. I'm here to talk about the evolving role of emojis in investigations and data security. How many of you are investigators? What about data security professionals? I know it kind of crosses over. Okay, fantastic. You might have seen Chet Hosmer on the agenda. He disappeared. Unfortunately, he due to a personal matter, he wasn't able to make it. So I'll be covering his part today. The RSA disclaimer, basically anything that I say is representation of my opinion. It doesn't represent RSA's. You could read this on your own time. I'm not going to directly read it, but a little bit about my background. I started Digital Mountain just over 20 years ago. We're a digital forensics, e-discovery, and cybersecurity company. I bought a yacht, not a yacht. And anybody know what a yacht is out there? I'm going to keep this interactive, so ask questions. I've left time. So a yacht is similar to a QR code, and it's an emoji sequence. And this, the scales, computer, and thumbs up actually forwards to the Digital Mountain site. And we actually own a second yacht, a computer, scales, and thumbs up. If you're in an Opera browser, you can enter emojis directly, and it'll go to a domain. So you can actually buy one emoji, two emojis. The more emojis there are in a sequence, the less dollars it costs to buy that yacht. But that's the future. So if you buy a thumbs up and a rock star, all you need is that, and it'll point to your domain as a shortcut. For regular browsers outside of Opera, you do have to enter a lot of overhead information. Hopefully that will change in future browsers with the HTTPS. Here, I'll point it out with the clicker since I have one. So right here, you have to put the HTTPS //y.at. Before Digital Mountain, I spent time in venture capital, specifically in data security, some of the first intrusion protection products, VMware on the data storage side. I've done a lot of other things, IT auditing at the Big Four, but anyway, that's a little bit about my background. How I ended up here on this stage is many years ago, I was at a techno security conference, and there was a gentleman speaking before it was cool on deep fakes. And I sat there, and being in the e-discovery world and dealing a lot with emojis, he had some technology to identify deep fakes, and was a deep fake expert before generative AI existed. And I said, I went up to him, I'm like, hey, what about emojis? And doing identification of that, because we as a company deal a lot with text messages and collaboration software, and emojis are in there. And so a lot of meaning gets lost if you're just looking at the text. And so we became fast friends, and that's Chet Hosmer, who was going to be here to co-present. He is a former professor at Arizona State University and the most amazing Python god that I've ever seen. And so I'll talk to you a little bit about what he developed later on. But in recognizing emojis, emojis across browsers, across applications, across operating systems, all can be a little bit different. So if you look here at the smiley face with the hearts around it, these are across different browsers or Google. There could be many, many different variations. And about 3,000 emojis are governed by something called the Unicode Consortium in Mountain View, California. They started in 1991. They have a subcommittee for emojis. So major Silicon Valley companies and tech companies elsewhere are part of that consortium, Google, Apple, you name it, and they submit their emojis. But kind of mind-blowing the number of emojis are out there. There's no way they can govern them all. And you look at this, the last iOS version on the iPhone, which is 17.4, they integrated the ability to basically layer emojis, so you could do a smiley face emoji with a cowboy hat. And so all these things are very tough to keep up with from a bit level and recognition. And so as you go across all these different devices, there's different emojis. Anybody read the New York Times on April 1st they had something called connections, and it's like a word puzzle. So they threw everybody off, and they did it with emojis instead of text. Pissed a whole bunch of people off that were their readers. What happened with the emojis and that game was that if some of their users were using laptops, they, instead of seeing the emoji rendering properly, they were getting the gibberish, you know, the squares, the question marks. They weren't even able to see the emojis unless they were on a smartphone. So you have to realize what you're sending out in the emoji world may not be seen in the same thing by the recipient. Everybody understand that concept? Great. Just to kind of throw out some really interesting examples, there was a user, and they were in Samsung 9, and they sent out a text, and it said, "Let's go play at the park," and there was a water gun. Well, the recipient got a "let's go play at the park" with a revolver. Like, okay, let's call the cops. Really different meaning. And so the other thing, on 2017, when it was World Chocolate Day, the Cookie Monster sent out a text, "Let's celebrate with chocolate chip cookies." He was on Samsung 9. The recipient of that got graham crackers. So when it translated. So you can see you have to be very, very careful. I think it's hard enough with text. Those that work with me that are in the room know that they may say something, and sometimes I'm just like, what are you saying? I don't understand. And so then you get in a whole nother situation when you're dealing with emojis. And if you're in tech, there's TLAs, right? 3-letter acronyms. And half the time you're like, I have no idea what this person's saying in this 3-letter acronym, and you've got to go try to look it up. Emojis are hieroglyphics to the next level, right? Where a lot of times we don't necessarily understand what the recipient's the sender's trying to say. On top of that, there's a lot of contextual where it may be like ironic, where, you know, they may be just kidding and they're saying the opposite. So there's a lot of translation that has to happen, and I'll get into kind of how do you solve that. When you look at the world, or specifically the US, there's different emojis here, and these are the most common used by state. This is from digitalinformationworld.com. Now what's interesting, you see the snowflake? That's New Hampshire, you know, and you go, okay, well, it snows in New Hampshire. Well, in other circles, that snowflake may mean cocaine. So, in, you know, drug circles, so, or a gas pump, you know, maybe a drug exchange. So you have to understand the communities that you're dealing with and how they use those emojis. If you look here, kind of the most common used ones are hearts, you know, flames, like you're hot, and then tears of joy. How many of you use like under 10 emojis? Let's say over the last 6 months. Well, under 10, under 5? Yeah, so a lot of us use the same emojis over and over again. If you listen to HR Advisor Daily, says that over the last 180 days, 71% of people use 10 emojis or less. Over 51% of the population uses 5 emojis or less over the last 180 days. So it's kind of like our closet, right? You know, 20% of our closet gets 80% of the use. That's how most of society works with emojis. This one's Europe, a little bit different. No snowflake, so I guess it doesn't snow as much. You've got a lot of hearts, tears of joy, a little bit mixing it up on the emoji scheme. And then what's interesting is if you go to South America, a lot of love, right? You know, let's pray for you, tears of joy, hearts. So what these do is really reflect the society and cultural differences. Some emojis, like in some cultures, the smiley face might not have a good meaning. So you have to really, you know, be aware of who you're talking to. So just to nibble on third-party keyboards. How many of you have a third-party keyboard on your device? Do you know what that is? Like if you have Bitmoji, you've got a third-party, or Venmo. And these have custom emoji packs. right, that may not be part of that Unicode consortium that I talked about earlier. Bitmoji, when you set up Bitmoji, you download it, there's actually a message from Apple, and it says, if you download this application, they may be able to see all your keystrokes. So for all you data security people, you know, if they're seeing your keystrokes, that means if the user's entering their username and password, they might be able to see that. Now in the terms of service for Bitmoji, it says, oh, we don't look at that and we only use it for this specific purpose. The other thing, when you use Bitmoji, you sit there and you take a picture of yourself, right? And then you're walking through all the preferences, what favorite color shirt you like, what glasses you want, your eyebrows. They've got your picture. So, these really cool apps, you might have users that get something from Russia and bam, they're able to get your keystrokes based on what the iOS says. So you have to be kind of careful with these cool new apps that are super fun, but they also, they might be a vulnerability on your phones and how you're using them. Any questions? No? Okay. But there are other things like Google has their own keyboard. There's so many of these custom keyboards that are super fun to go use. And you just have to be aware of the strengths and drawbacks as you download these products. So now I get kind of, I know everything's about AI, but this is, and you probably can't see that. So I'm going to tell you kind of the key points. So I went into my Facebook account and I did an export. Anybody ever do that on their own data? If you're on Facebook or Amazon, most of these major sites, if they're mature, they allow you to download your own data to see what they're tracking on you. And what's interesting is Facebook started tracking emojis. And they track the frequency that you're using the emoji, so does Twitter, when you started using the emoji. Now you think about this, and as there's APIs that reach out to these social media networks, and generative AI, alas, has come along, these phishing efforts reach a whole new level. Because if you're using those emojis and a recipient's like, oh, well, Julie always uses that emoji, or this is her text. If you've played around with ChatGPT, you can say like, look, I want an abstract talking about emojis using Shakespeare or Dr. Seuss or whatever tone, but if there's not enough snippets out with your voice on social media, voice whether it's text or actually your voice, this can emulate you and to a recipient. And that includes emojis and access to the API. But they're tracking that across their community. It's very powerful if you think about Facebook. They have about 3 billion users. A third of the world is on Facebook. So lots of emojis being tracked. That's new over the last couple years that they're tracking emojis. Good news is that they purged all the facial recognition data, but now they're tracking this. So homework, go home this weekend. If you're on Facebook, export your data, take a peek what they're grabbing on you and what emojis you're using. So lawsuits. Since we're in e-discovery as a company, there's a gentleman by the name of Eric Goldman, and he is a professor at Santa Clara University down the street from our office. I've been over to talk to Eric. He tracks all these emoji cases. So every time there's an emoji case, it hits Eric's radar. And you can see this kind of hockey stick growth of emojis over time. So I'm going to walk you through my 4 favorite cases the last 3 or so years, just so you can get a flavor. So the Washington versus Board of Education represents a dismissal of a teacher. Grow versus Aronik represents trademark. I'm going to walk you through these. Rossbach versus Monophore. This is my favorite because there's a forensics element of a forged text message. And Southwest Terminal represents a contractual agreement, commercial agreement through an emoji. So this first one was a substitute teacher. He was a coach. And there was interpretation of his emoji. I heard you were crying, that practice got canceled. So I'm going to come up with an individual practice for you. Thumbs up emoji. Don't worry, kid, I got you, winking emoji. The coach, I wasn't crying. Washington responded, are you sure? To which the student did not reply. The parent got upset and of the student, who was a high-ranking CPS official, filed the complaint with regard to the Washington texting. The coach substitute teacher, Washington, was suspended. So this is what happens in these school, we work on school cases all the time. Usually they're put on administrative leave. He was reinstated as a teacher, but he lost his job as a coach and a mental health specialist as a result. So you have to be really careful how your emojis can be interpreted by the recipient. Similar to sexual harassment, you may say something, it's more with the recipient, how they perceive what you're saying, not what you intended to say. So the Garar versus Aaronic was a picture, and the poster who was Smith, who worked for Aaronic LLC, did a post, and he thought he was crediting the author of the picture by putting a little camera icon, and then he put it at Anthony Garreau. Anthony Garreau felt like this was not appropriate crediting and that there was copyright infringement, and went after the company for using his IP in a trademark infringement matter. So there's ambiguity about if that emoji really gave proper credit by putting a camera icon. My favorite one is Rosbach versus Monophore. This is 2021. Basically, what was produced was PDF and JPEG images. What was interesting about this is a sexual harassment case. And these were fraudulent text messages. And how did they know they were fraudulent? So forensics examination was conducted of these messages. And these, the custodian or the user, who was a woman, said, look, I use iPhone 5. I'm sorry, the gentleman uses iPhone 5 with iOS 10. Well, these emojis, not only the battery pack, but the heart there was on iOS 13. So, in other words, it was produced in a later version of the phone, and those emojis didn't exist on the phone that was supposed to have been used. Does that make sense? So it proved fraud, and that these images were forged. The most recent case was from 2023. Many of you may have read about this. It was out of Canada. There was a thumbs up emoji. There was a farmer, Chris Actor, who failed to deliver 86 tons of flax of grain to the buyer, Kent Mickelbar, who was looking to purchase it in 2021. Mickelbar texted the farmer a draft of the contract and please confirm flax contract, in which he got a thumbs up back. That, you know, and in some cases that could mean, yeah, I got it. Does it mean agreement? Well, the courts, yes. That meant that was contractually binding that there was a thumbs up. And, you know, it gets into cultural differences. The farmer was fined $61,000 for non-delivery. It kind of gets into cultural differences too. Like, you know, there's certain cultures that will nod, but it doesn't mean necessarily agreement. So there's a lot of dispute over, you know, whether, you know, a thumbs up means agreement. I don't know. I do thumbs up all the time. You know, so it's subject to interpretation. So diving deeper into emojis. Any questions so far? Anyone? No? Okay. So what do these emojis mean? Do emojis hold clues? Can emojis be potentially dangerous if used in the wrong way? And what are some best practices? So this dashboard represents something that Chet developed, because originally when we had talked 7 years ago, Chet went off and he developed a database. And it was actually with his students at Arizona University. And basically this database would map any emojis similar to what Emojipedia does and was tracking it in a better way. The challenge is there became too many emojis. I believe it's Slack, they have 24 million emojis being used that are just custom created by corporations. You know, so if you look at the Unicode Consortium, they're only tracking 3,000. So it's not going to get you there about all the communication that's going on. And so Chat basically chucked the database lookup and embedded generative AI on the back end, which is really cool because as you're dealing with emojis and sentences, it can come up with interpretation of what that means. Because beyond single emojis, there's a lot more that's going on out there in communication. And if you can't see that, I'm going to walk you through some examples without using his product. So these are emojis. So Chet studied Twitter, now X. And you can access the API, and it was the Ukraine conflict. So he was trying to find out information about what was being exchanged as all these events were going on and bombings and everything. And a lot of these communications had emojis within them. So this is an example of one tweet. And so what's the translation? So it's, as you're using it, so ice cream, woman, face palming, medium light skin tone, lollipop, and cupcake. And then the language, though I'm not the only one. So second example, this is the raw tweet that he pulled. I'm not ready for documentary. And so what is the translation of this? The pleading face, loudly crying face. So they're really suffering, right, in what's going on. Another tweet translation with Ukraine, the fists going up, raised, so they're rallying and trying to fight the combat, light skin tone, and the winking face with the tongue. So shot there, mobilization. So a lot of these communications today, from my end on the intelligence, when you're dealing with anything, whether it's war or news reporters or law enforcement, military intelligence, there's location-based social intelligence. You can go by geolocation, but this is taking it a step farther about how you're dealing with text, how you're dealing with different languages, and how you're dealing with emojis. Because at the end of the day, emojis are a different language. So you should think of it like Spanish or French or anything else. Another example is, so what he's doing is he's taking these emojis, he's translating them kind of on the fly. So left arrow, high voltage, crown, push pin, comment. So time to follow, let's rally, let's go fight. Let's go fight those Russians. So they're mobilizing. Here's another example with the muscle and the airplane, the biceps, the small airplane, made in Turkish and Ukraine. So there's mixed language here, glory to Ukraine. So when you're looking in product development, he's grabbing the characters basically using UTF-8 and 2 bytes and 4 bytes. So you have characters and then you have the hex equivalent. And so that's kind of the math or the technology and the encoding going on the back end. So as he looked at this, he said, okay, let's figure out using generative AI, what's the meaning of the included emoji? And is it consistent with the associated tweet? Because you can have an emoji that actually is like, a little cheeky and ironic and actually going in the opposite way of what is being said. Is it possible to identify the sentiment from the embedded emojis? What's the meaning? Like I said, I have a hard enough time speaking with people and understanding what they're saying, and then you combine emojis in there, and I still, and then what language is the text in? Does the the emojis reference social issues. What are global or international issues as you're dealing with military intelligence? And what are the political issues? Is there any covert communications going on? So he's bringing basically AI into the equation and analyzing this using Python scripts. Has anyone played with generative AI? If you've played with ChatGPT, then you know, but there's a lot of LLM models. Chat bases his technology right now on ChatGPT or OpenAI. You know, what's happening right now is there's just 50 flavors of LLMs popping up, and you can plug in whatever's the best one at the time to yield the best model in prompt engineering. So we're looking at sentiment analysis and then taking anything that's not English and converting it into English using technology and developing what's the meaning behind those. And actually, just as a side note, I was at a RSA driving back, and I hadn't driven that far because it was the pandemic and we were in lockdown. And I had a 2-hour drive back and had a new car, and I didn't realize on my drive back, all of a sudden somebody was texting me with all these emojis, and it was like, happy emoji, thumbs up. And you know, this I have Australian and as my Surrey, you know, or my speech translate. Anyway, so it kind of woke me up really quickly on my quiet drive home. So there's a lot going on there and how emojis are converted to text. So this is an example of the output without actually bringing the tool up. And I know I'm going to read that. I hate to read, but I know that this is really small and some of you might not be able to read it. So it's basically running through his AI analysis tool. So it accesses the API of, for example, of X or Twitter, watching the news and feeling frustrated with political corruption. There's smiley face. It's time for real accountability, the muscle emoji. So the primary so analyzes the language, it's English, and the sentiment of this message is frustration and determination. So this is using generative AI. The emoji analysis, yes, the emojis match the sentiment of the frustration, determination to hold politicians accountable. The angry face emoji and the flexing muscle emoji convey the feeling of being fed up and ready to take action. Political relevance, which is the category he basically did prompt engineering on, is yes, the text contains political issues related to frustration with political corruption and a call for accountability. So what's the global relevance, which is the category? The text references both global and international issues. Political corruption is a widespread problem that occurs in many countries around the world, making it a global issue. The use of the word accountability also suggests a desire for change on a larger scale, indicating an international issue. The social issues are, yes, the text references the social issue of political corruption and the frustration and call for accountability surrounding it. So when you're dealing with millions of chatter, this can be really relevant to trying to narrow down what's important for military intelligence. The next one is actually in French. And so he takes that and then provides the English translation. I'm going to make you regret what you did, 2 emojis, and I'm not kidding. So the sentiment of this is angry and threatening. The emoji analysis is, the emojis do not match the sentiment of the message. So this is one of those where it's kind of opposite of what the text says, and it basically does all that work rather than having a human read it. And the political relevance is it's just expressing anger and a threat. Global relevance, no. Social issues, no. So another one, researching foreign policy decisions. Understanding global dynamics is crucial for the informed opinions. So this is English. It's positive and informative. Emoji analysis, yes, the emojis match the sentiment of the message, so there's not in conflict. Political relevance, yes. Global relevance, it does represent international issues, and social issues, yes. There's another one, discussing immigration policies at work today, with how divided opinions are. This is primary language is English. The sentiment of the message is mixed or conflicted. The emojis do not match the sentiment of the message. Yes, the text contains political issue and social issues. Yes, the text references the social issue. There's a couple more examples. This one happens to be in Chinese. And it says, I just completed a long distance trip. I feel energized and excited. So sentiment, it yielded positive. Emoji analysis, yes, the emojis match the sentiment of the message. No political reference. And then the text does not specifically reference global or international issues. Social issues, no. This one is in German, you'll regret provoking me. Okay, so there's a lot of hostility. A fire flame, angry face, this is a warning. It's a negative, using generative AI, it said that this is a negative message. Yes, the emojis match. Political relevance, no. Global relevance, there's no global relevance or social issues. This one's in Russian, and it says, you better collect your thoughts because I am serious. It expresses frustration and anger as a sentiment. Emoji analysis, the emojis do not match the sentiment of the message. Political relevance, no. The text does not reference global or international issues. Social issues, no. So what Chat was trying to do here, and I'm sorry he couldn't be here today, was show you how you can take millions of these text messages, whether with emojis, whether it's Ariana Grande bombing or threat in London, or something that's a shooting at a school, or something that's going on in Ukraine, and kind of distill it in a more automated way without humans on deck doing that social media intelligence. So then you can use a database to narrow it down and hone in on what's really important. At DEF CON, anyone go to DEF CON? So there was a presentation that was done by Hadrian Barrel and Georges Axel Jaloyan that actually showed emojis being used to distribute malware. And so similar to QR codes and things like that, emojis can be used in a similar way. And I showed you with the yats. So I know you guys are all going to rush home and you're going to all buy a yat. Unless you are a .com or have a really great data security company that you just sold, maybe you'll buy a yacht. But any questions on that? So in best practices on emojis, what is done is collecting the data, examining it, considering whether it's a threat or not, and then examining the kind of narrowed down population of the sequences of emojis, and the large sequences, and then malware. Do they contain malware? So I know this isn't like widely used, but it can be used to distribute malware. So it's just something, if you're a data security professional out there, you should be aware of other ways. So real quick, quiz, funny. I'm not gonna put up the answers yet. What do you think the first one is saying? So these aren't like single emojis, these are emoji sentences. Oh, wait, I heard it in the back. Very, very good. Silence of the Lambs. What about the second one?
Indiana Jones.
Yeah, you got it, you got it. And the third one? Yeah, Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. So you can see how you can put these strings of emojis together to have meaning that are not sentences. And very good, this is very smart audience. What about this first one?
Stop gun violence.
Yep. What about the next one? Very, very close. You got that one in my mind. And then this last one, threats. So these sequence of emojis can have a lot of meaning. Again, we're back to hieroglyphic days, really. We've gone full circle back to the Egyptian era. Before I cover this, any questions? Any war stories?
How does AI sentiment analysis determine whether or not when the emoji doesn't match the text, if it's just something that doesn't match or if it's actual like sarcasm or playfulness? Like how does it?
Yeah, so Chat's not here, but I'm going to give you my translation of the answer. So he converts it to text and then uses generative AI basically to know whether it matches or not. And is that perfect? As all we for those of us that have played, there's still a hallucination factor. Is it better than human effort, given costs? These technologies have some value, but they're not 100% accurate. So you have to have human eyes on deck. They're just technology-aided generative AI. Right now, I would never let generative AI make the decision at the end of the day. I think that it's a good tool to give us guidance, to save time, but we still need to put human eyes on deck. Does that answer your question? Okay, great.
Does the generative AI, does it take into account the local meanings or the regional meanings of the emojis?
Yeah.
How much of it does that?
Yeah, so it translates the local knowledge. I don't think, I'm not sure if that part is there yet to translate the local meaning. I think that's really hard because, like I said in the beginning, there are some cultures that a smiley face is not good. And I think, but what you can do if you feed it LM, as you know, if you're dealing, for example, in drug cases and you're at the DEA, you can fine tune generative AI, for the gas pump or the snowflake being cocaine, and there's all these different things, or eggplant, what that means, and a peach, and it goes on and on, where these things have high heel pumps, they have special meaning that who would have guessed.
Have you seen enough being encouraged for luring people to take those steps?
I have not yet, but I think similar to a QR code, it's something that needs to be watched out for. I don't know how many Yats have been purchased yet. I know I kind of jumped on it kind of early and bought my Yats because I don't know, I thought it was going to take off. I probably bought them 2 years ago. We'll see. It's still in the Opera browser. They still forward. It's part of the whole NFT craze. Sometimes I do things a little earlier than most. But like I said, if you want to own one Yat, like the thumbs up Yat, it's going to be very expensive. But you just have to look at it like a QR code that it will route. It's a shortcut to get to a domain so that a user or who you're communicating doesn't have to remember a huge long string for a domain. Was that new for everybody, the Yats? Did anyone know about Yats? Oh, good. I was excited when I learned about Yats. Any other questions? We factored in a lot of extra time for Q&A. So without any more questions, so what you can take back to the office is really start looking into for data security. Think about how it's going to factor in to your investigations and how your employees may be using emojis. There are technologies that do that translation. They're trying, they're being more optimized. A lot of the technology industry is changing out their databases because there's too many emojis to keep up with, and adding more generative AI. So you're going to start seeing a lot more developments around that translate those emojis and they take them into consideration. You have to be able to read them. So if they're gibberish, there's not much you can do. So you have to make sure, like I had mentioned on the game, that that they're readable. Things like phones, it's a big problem. We do phone forensics all the time. If you take that out of its native phone environment on a certain font pack, the only thing you can do is then look up the hash values or the digital fingerprint, and if that would need to be in a database to retranslate it back. So it's really, really complicated. So in the short term, kind of think about these emojis as part of your investigations in data security. Start incorporating it into your practice. And then in the first 3 months, start looking at technologies that you can use, and then within 6 months, actually start implementing it into your investigations as part of your data security program. And think about your HR employee handbooks too. If there's emojis that are, and how employees should be using emojis, so you don't end up in a lawsuit with like a thumbs up being misinterpreted, or skin color, emojis. Things can get misinterpreted really fast, and in those sexual harassment cases, it's about what the recipient feels, and so it does open up some exposure. And I'm finishing early, so you can move on to your RSA drinks, and I'll stick around if anybody has any questions. I really appreciate you being with me on this journey. I'm so sorry that Chet wasn't able to make it. Was there a question? Nope, just you.
Are you familiar with has anyone done anything in the vulnerability space with regard to trying to identify individuals by them, like identity proofing or validation as a factor?
Yeah, and I think there's yeah, absolutely. And I think when you're dealing with forensics, or you're in military intelligence, people have routines. Now, what I worry about and what keeps me up at night is things like WormGPT, which is the evil twin to ChatGPT, and how these technologies can grab our speech or our voice, our text, our emojis, and then pretend like they're, for phishing or fooling people, tricking people that are loved ones, in personal harm or financial harm, or however it's going to be used. I don't know if that answered your question, but I think that people have trends, and but I think there's also authentication. Is that who you think that you're communicating with? And if something's really a unique emoji, could that be used as potentially proof that authentication that person was it? When you're dealing with social media, it's really hard because you have to be in the back end to see IP addresses and things like that. When you're dealing with email and internet headers, and back in the day, you could pin the tail on the donkey of where somebody was and start authenticating that way. But it's one validation point in proving that somebody was who they said, but you have to surround that by other events, because if it's all public record and that person uses that emoji all the time, somebody could impersonate them pretty easily too. So it's not evidence in itself. Are you in law enforcement? No. Identity management, yeah. So I wouldn't use an emoji in itself for identity. As a single factor that somebody did something. Right. Right. But it's a really great question, and I think we deal with authentication all the time, where we get calls, this person posted a social media post that affected a company's branding, or from a competitor who did it, and trying to prove that out. And some of those are hard because you have to go through the hosting provider, of the application to get more information. Sometimes you don't have that on your fingertips as part of your investigation. Yeah. Anybody using that for authentication? I don't know that. Any other questions?
Yes.
All right.
Is there any body that governs how, how the emoji is going to look? Because it looks really, really different between the Samsung and Apple, or is it treated like something like a font?
Yes.
How does that work?
Well, if it's part of the 3,000 emojis that are part of the emoji consortium, you know, all these major tech companies are part of that. Those are going to look normal. The ones that are outside of that, or when you combine, so, you know, now you can layer your emojis, like what I was talking about, smiley face with a cowboy hat. You know, you're going to get squares, you know, potentially, or if it's not recognizable by the iOS, or you have a custom emoji pack. So
I mean, it just seems really fast and loose. I mean, in terms of how fast
Yeah.
these things come out, and I would imagine. I mean, I don't know how you would govern that. There's a lot of talk of governance over this whole conference. I don't really see how that works here.
yeah, I mean, the only hope probably is the Unicode Consortium in Mountain View, but the emoji translation is very, very hard, and I think you as the recipient have to be, is that what you meant? You know, this is what I'm seeing on my end. I mean, we deal with WYSIWYG issues all the time, right? This is back to the day where you get something, and I've had, you know, users in Word, you know, outside of our environment, and they show me the PDF, and it looks totally different in Word, and they're in Microsoft as well, and on my receiving end, how the font looks and things like that. So I think it's a similar issue, and it's not static, and because you have so many browsers and you have so many third-party applications and interoperability issues, you just have to really question if you're getting something that you don't understand. It comes back to the old days of picking up the phone. Did you mean to say that? Right? So it comes down to communication. And, you know, I think it's in a lot of these business email compromises, right, and financial fraud and like wires that are going out, which we deal with all the time. People forget to pick up the phone. I mean, they're so reliant on technology, and yeah, sure, you know, you want to change your bank information from Wells Fargo to Bank of America, or, you know, some foreign bank, and they just do it, and they don't pick up the phone for 2 seconds to authenticate that change should occur. And I think, you know, we get back to just being human and picking up the phone and having a conversation. And I think, I know this is an emoji discussion, but, you know, I keep on asking people that I know the last week, you know, what percentage of your time are you in the digital world versus like present in the physical world? You know, and we're starting to become more avatars and more in the digital world, even when we're around people, you know, in Starbucks or people that we know, and these texts are blinging, and we're all ADD, right? Because you have so many different so many different apps on your phone, and you're just trying to keep up. And so, you know, I can't change that trend, but, you know, I worry about, you know, the future, you know, a little bit, and augmented, you know, we're dealing with augmented reality. Actually, as a family, we're actually doing an augmented reality, you know, game in a couple weeks. But there's definitely this blending and how we deal with it to be, you know, not lose connection on a, you know, being here and present. So, any other questions? I'm going off on a tangent due to time. With that, you get out 5 minutes early. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned a little bit about emojis that you didn't know, and I hope you were able to implement it in the workplace or into your life. And I appreciate you going on this journey with me. Thank you.